So I'm Todd Bittner. The name of my talk is Exploring Generative AI Through the Lens of Mock Data, or the alternate title is There Be Dragons in My Room. I wasn't really sure how I was going to nail that delivery, and that's fine. I didn't need to. So let's get started. A couple ground rules. No touching, because I don't know. I just decided to put that in because I was thinking about ground rules anyway, and there isn't a whole lot going on. Since we're over Zoom, we've got that one covered, so not a big deal. Otherwise, anything goes. I was aiming for a 45-minute talk with 15 minutes interspersed for QA throughout or after the talk. As I've done a couple of rehearsals, it seems to go a little bit longer. But that also may shorten because people tend to have a tendency to speed up talking when they're actually in a live environment. Otherwise, I am trying to keep it to about an hour and 15 minutes, so I don't necessarily, take too much of your time on a Tuesday night, especially since my typical delivery is known as essentially as Ben Stein on Quaaludes. So feel free to ask questions at any point or not. That's fine. I'll just keep going because I'm used to talking to myself at this point. Let's see. Disclaimer, I've done some pretty strong research in the field over the last few months. I started before I quit my job. But I haven't looked at all the actual mathematical constructs behind Gen AI. I know the basics. I know about its probabilistic theory. I know, things about like neural nets to some extent. But if you're asking me, how some of the actual equations are derived or what's going on with some of the calculus, I will say that I don't necessarily know that. I'm not making any attempts to try and hand wave anything away or to hallucinate in a lot of senses. But if I'm, if you know something more than me, and that's entirely possible, feel free to correct me. Feel free to disagree. Feel free to ask for clarification. So that's it. Those are pretty much the ground rules. And I did put in a note here that I probably didn't rehearse this ahead of time and will be apt to treat my notes as a teleprompter. I did rehearse twice, but I'll still be apt to treat my notes as a teleprompter. So a little bit about me. I have a bachelor's of science in mechanical engineering from Champaign and a master's in computer science from DePaul. I've been in the software engineering industry for about 20 years, a little bit more. I was at Orbit/Expedia/Agencia/Amex GBT for 3 weeks shy of 18 years. So I spent more time there than I have in just about any other place, even including the town in which I grew up. I spent the first 10 years or so of my career as a developer. I was predominantly a Java developer, I think is probably the best way to put it. I did some Python and then Erlang. Yep. Yeah, it is Erlang. Okay, that's odd, but still Erlang. So I have some experience in Erlang. Great language, by the way. So I also have the requisite backend developer's limited understanding of JavaScript. So I know to grumble about the number of frameworks that are still coming out to this day. After that first 10 years, I spent the next 10 years or so managing software engineers or managers of software engineers. So I climbed my way firmly up the middle of the corporate ladder. And then in April, I quit to form my own company, Coastal Chicago LLC. And so far, I've been spending far more money than I'm taking in. So I must be a Silicon Valley darling at this point, which bodes well for me in the future. If you're interested, ostensibly, my company offers consulting and software engineering and software engineering management. So if you have naive and rich friends, please tell them that I'm for hire. I also have a blog that I've been contributing to pretty regularly at chicagobotdog.com, as you can see in the link here. And I also contribute via LinkedIn as well at this point. A couple of fun facts about me. Or I already spoiled this, but I may have managed some of you in this meetup. But another big fun fact is that I have been to McHenry County. I think once. I've been to Lake County a few times, but McHenry County. So I don't get out of Cook County too much. I'm an exciting person. All right. So the whole impetus for this thing is shortly before quitting, I tried to think of an angle for keeping myself occupied and for drumming up business once I knew I was going to quit. And given my experience, I decided to test creating a fake online travel site, an OTA, using generative AI as a partner. And just for anybody who wanted to heckle me, I started writing this 2 days after the recent stock market meltdown. That's on the second and the fifth, and which has since recovered. In addition to other causes, though, there's been a lot of speculation that this off was due in part to investors' skeptical takes on the return on investment for generative AI efforts. There will be a healthy dose of skepticism here. So if you were hoping for me to be a fanboy, that's not necessarily going to be the case. Although I will lay out a few good points I think here. So if if you're going to throw virtual tomatoes at me, that's fine. You can, but I'm not really an AI bro in this case. Um, so I started getting back to this fake online travel site. I started using Chat GPT 3.5 as my assistant. I didn't have any anticipation of using its API calls. I was just going to use the web or mobile interface to basically garner the broader advice. And more importantly, it was free. All of the API itself is not expensive, depending on how many calls you're going to make. But I just wanted to go through and show like, oh, here's where it works, here's where it doesn't work. Here's where there's an issue with the hype, and here's where things actually are useful. I had actually anticipated sourcing my content, so all these hotels that I'm talking about from a known provider, so not actually making that content up, but using either their fake content or using their real content that was sort of delayed. So I had no expectation of creating this mock data at first. I'll tell you why I got into that in a minute. And as I mentioned before, I'm not necessarily going to get into the technical details of generative AI or large language models in particular. So if you're, talking about token generation, the temperature of even the machines when you're asking them for queries, and machine learning mechanisms like neural nets driving the training phases, I'm not going to go into that. I will certainly get into some code. I'm sort of straddling the meta arguments and then some of the code as well, because I know it's a tech talk. I don't want to completely hand wave all that away. But for the purpose of this talk, I'm treating the models as black boxes, which is what they are essentially, because at best they are pseudo open source by nature. So even when something like Meta claims that it's open source, it's only open source in certain cases as far as like the mechanism concerned, not necessarily the training data. So when I got started, my first query was literally this one. Okay, computer, I want to start an online travel agency. Help me get started with the basics. And I had some optimism, but I also had, it's a mix of optimism and skepticism at this point. I was taking a page from the AI bros who've sworn up and down that on my LinkedIn feed and articles as well, that generative AI is great at providing structure and content in these types of situations. Giving you ideas that you may or may not have thought about before. And for the basics, it did remind me of a few basics that I'd forgotten. But if this is anything close to the level of detail taught in business school at this point, I'm really concerned for our future businesses. Although for the way I pick on MBAs anyway, and sorry for any of you who are MBAs, I'm more for our future businesses. And I will remind you again, simply, if you have a question, please interrupt, because I can't see you. Plus, I'm fine with just being interrupted. So, like I said, I was a little bit naive at this point. I was expecting a little bit more from the technical aspect of things, at least from the outset. I didn't expect it to just spit out code for me. But when I got to the section here that was talking about, the technical aspect of what needs to be done, I was expecting more than I should hire a developer and use WordPress, Wix, or Shopify, especially given the hype around what AI is asking, or Gen AI has been asking for at this point. So, so much for it being a standalone high-level consultant for my fully functional ersatz travel site here. Like I said, I was a little bit skeptical at the outset, or sorry, I was skeptical at the outset, but I still did have some optimism for what was happening, and this was sort of like, okay, this is going to be a bit of a tougher road to hoe than I thought. But again, this is for writing the actual travel site. Ultimately, I have to say this is probably a good thing, though, especially given that hype. I would be a bit pissed off at this point if a toaster could take my job. So I'm happy that software engineering still holds water as far as a profession, and I don't think that's going to go away anytime soon. I do tend to conspiratorially think that maybe the reason that everybody's trying to get rid of software engineers is because at Silicon Valley is creating Gen AI, and they have to deal with software engineers all the time, and they're just tired of us. So I don't know if that's true, but that's my own conspiracy theory. Coincidentally, around this time, I also started using a coding assistant just because it had crossed my feed, and I'd heard about GitHub Copilot a little bit, and heard that it was useful in some cases, but hadn't really checked it out, and still haven't looked at it too much today. I'm using something else. It's called Codium, not to be confused with Codium, both of which I think, as far as I know, are pronounced the same. The one I use is CODEIUM, and the other one is CODIUM. And I've got a link for it later on in the presentation. But the one I'm using is an open source version that plugs into VS Code and also works well with GitHub Spaces. So I'll get to my thoughts on coding assistants in a bit, but first, I think it's time to start talking about the whole mock data portion. And so this is one of the images that I constructed or asked for when I was looking for locations for my mock data. And I don't know what you think of this. I was, this is ostensibly Paris. But if I don't know if you noticed, it's a very odd thing going on here with this particular view of Paris, and that there's an Eiffel Tower in the background and there's an Eiffel Tower in the foreground. And it really confused me because, especially during the Olympics, I didn't know which one that Celine Dion was singing from prior to in the opening ceremonies. So if you can't tell already, Gen AI is going to throw us some shenanigans before we're done. But I mean, I guess it certainly looks like Paris, even without sort of the Eiffel Tower, I suppose. As I mentioned before, I didn't expect to generate my own data. I was hunting around, and I knew that a system called Amadeus, which is a global distribution system. For those of you who don't know, it's also GDS. It's a broker for airline and online and other travel reservations. So basically, it's a clearinghouse for anything that you're ever going to reserve a travel reservation through. It's changed a little bit, but that's still the major mode for how anything gets done in travel. And they had limited free access to their API. At one point, other OTAs did too, including my own dear Expedia. But due to the drain on the systems or any lack of discernible profit, they cut the whole free API portion out, which isn't unusual, I think, for a lot of businesses now. But that's fine. I thought I had Amadeus to deal with, and I was also excited to show, like, okay, this is a showcase, I guess, for some of what I'm going to do. And one of the big things that software engineers have to do is hook up to somebody else's API and deal with all the odd calls that are present. I was prepared to spend some time doing that. Except that much of the Amadeus API was also paywalled, which I didn't know beforehand. For instance, I believe that only 2 hotels, one in London and one in New York, and they only had like a handful of locations anyway, provided content descriptions for the rooms. So I only had 2 potential room descriptions. Much of the content that was there wasn't necessarily of good quality and wasn't consistently formatted, and there were no available photographs. Now, this is to be expected, especially in the travel industry, but I think in most industries, because like content is gold, right? Especially with something that's more commoditized like travel, you want to spend time figuring out how to differentiate yourself, and content is very important. So of course, they're not going to give that kind of stuff away for free. If I were starting my own OTA, online travel agency, I would put in the hard work to source the content, clean it up. And if I had the capital, I'd employ people to write about everything separately and take photographs. But this is a fake travel site, so fake data is perfectly acceptable. Historically, creating mock data at scale, especially data that has semantic meaning, isn't just pure gibberish, the lorem ipsum type of thing that's used for formatting, is extremely difficult. Sites like Faker.js and his Python counterpart they do a pretty good job of typing certain types of data, and can provide a rich source of random values, but the semantic value can be dubious. Some things work out well if you're using something like 123 Main Street, New Orleans. Likely fake, you can probably pick up on it, but it's not enough to sort of knock you off your game and unsuspend disbelief. Whereas something like New Orleans, New York is probably going to jar you and think like, okay, what's going on here? It's not completely crazy and made up. So I'm not in this space of like make believe, but it's also, I know there's no New Orleans, New York. So why even, what's going on here? Your brain has a disconnect at that point. And without significant cleanup, something like Faker isn't going to be able to generate data that passes the good enough test that we crave as humans. In addition, Faker isn't going to have something like API calls with faker.hotel name or faker.hotel description that provide realistic content. So you're going to have to do a lot more work if you want to get something that's travel specific. So here's a query. This is a pretty standard query. And again, I'm just going to ask if you got questions. Feel free to interrupt me. Otherwise, I'm happy that you're either listening or sleeping as I go through all of this. I separated the queries from the functions, calling them to make maintaining or tweaking them easier. It's just, pure separation of concerns. The calls to the large language model were extremely similar, so I didn't really need to couple the strings to the API calls themselves, and I didn't have to do a lot of work to separate it either, which was nice. As you can guess from my code, I'm using SQLite to store my text data, and I'm also using Python, if I haven't been explicit in that and you weren't able to tell. The AST module was extremely useful in parsing the values returned from the LLM call. And this, I learned this actually from the coding assistant. The literal function call is ast.literal eval. And it does a great job of just generating the appropriate data structures without me needing to fuss about with JSON format particulars as to whether or not I've got the correct quotes or something else in line. Replicate, you can see there is the name of the API site providing access to several open source models at fairly reasonable prices. At the time that I started this, I said I started with ChatGPT 3.5, but Llama 3 from Meta had come out. And its introduction was another strong driver for me to create my own mock data because its price per call, even with its beefier 80 billion context token model, was significantly cheaper than ChatGPT. So it's like, okay, now I don't necessarily have to futz around with being able to play with somebody else's sourcing data, and it gives me a good chance to practice something different as far as like what Gen AI is capable of. I will say whatever my reservations are about Gen AI, Replicate is definitely a great site for open source types of models for any kind of Gen AI. I used it for both the description portion of it, the LLM portion of it, and then also the image portion of it. Its usage instructions are clear, and its pricing is reasonable and straightforward. And in case you're wondering, no, I'm not getting paid to promote it. If I'd be happy to, but I'm not. And the utilities module is just simply something that I created for handling some basic functionality. So that's my own thing. A little aside, F-string functionality in Python, I love it. It's very easy as far as like string token replacement. There are very few things that I've seen that are better. I know it's a simple thing, but it's the simple things that always make us feel a little bit better. If you're looking at this, you can probably guess from the final line that I ran into some extraneous, oh, look, I want to be a human too type of thing. And I really want to help you. And so I needed to be very explicit in saying, like, do not add a summary or disclaimer at the beginning of your end, at the beginning or end of your reply. Because otherwise it would always say like, oh, yes, when I asked for like something in a particular format, I'd always say like, oh, of course I can help you. Then it would spit it out. And then it would say like, oh, and there's the reply that you have or something along those lines. And I didn't want that. I just want straight data. You can see that I have a return format, a very simple return format of open bracket, description, close bracket. That was a final iteration of data formatting. I wanted those brackets in place just in case it did have that little disclaimer before and after so that I could easily parse what I was getting without having to try and sift through natural language processing types of data. when I first started writing the queries, I fell into the trap of a developer saying like, "Oh, I need something that's very API specific, say a JSON format, something along these lines." And this is something where I think Gen AI certainly shines, is that you can specify whatever API or data format you need in order to adjust to what you need to parse, and it will usually get it right. Um, but well, I'll get to a couple caveats, but it's nice where okay, you don't need something that's of a structured type that may or may not be easy to parse or may fail parsing if it's not, say, valid JSON. You can just simply say open bracket, do this, do that, maybe have it pipe delimited, colon delimited, whatever you may need, and it can change from query to query. So here's the API call, the one that goes to replicate. Simple, really. You get an API token and sort in your environment variables. That's done outside of this, so it knows that the token's already there. Pass the query to the specified model, Llama 3 in this case. Adjust the tokens for length your output is needed. The default is 512 for a couple things. I think when I needed to grab hotels and descriptions, I needed 1024, but that's about as much as I needed. And then all I do is I capture the output, and then I apply that ast.literally to the whole function or to the output, and basically have it captured as a Python data structure, which I can manipulate pretty easily from there.
Question about the max tokens. That's the
Yeah.
context that you're passing into it that it's going to consider.
No, and that is that is one thing that's a little bit confusing as far as the this model is concerned. That is the output.
Okay.
So this is what it's spitting out, because that's what I thought. It's like, okay, no, 512 was enough for me, but it is in the documentation. And again, this is a replicate specific thing, not something that's general to AI. So here's one of the descriptions that I came up, or that I received, as far as New York. You look at it, it's like, not bad, huh? I mean, mm, not the most exciting, but also not bad, and it has an explanation point at the end, so it invokes fun. So let's look at a few more descriptions, right? So things are humming along, right? Well, let's see. Well, experience the ultimate urban getaway in Los Angeles. Okay. Experience the vibrant energy of Chicago. All right. Experience the vibrant energy of Houston. That seems very similar. Experience the rich history, vibrant. So it's more words, but we're still experiencing a lot. With Philly. And guess what the next 4 out of 5 are? Um, there's nothing wrong with any of these descriptions. Right? I haven't checked all of them. I have got 90 total locations, but for the ones I did check, they're factually accurate. They're not exciting. To me, they read as someone who's wholeheartedly embraced toxic positivity and is just bursting to enumerate every possible cliche they could about a destination. I could have upped the temperature too of what the responses that I'm getting back. So that's if you don't know much about Gen AI temperatures, the level of randomness that you're getting back from response. The more you up a temperature, the more quote unquote creative it gets. But that creativity is certainly a subjective thing, and I don't know that I would ever say an LLM is is creative. But what I would have gotten if I increased it too much would have been some weird, strange combination of a Joyce Faulkner word salad baby. So I just decided to leave it with the basic. I think I don't remember what it's set at, but it's 0.5, 0.7, and I think it goes up to like 4 or 5, which is essentially where at that point you're just getting experimental jazz. I also at one point I'd wanted to do the whole thing, as far as like I wanted my mock data to be created as determine what destinations I had, and get a a complete list that was spanning the globe, just for interest's sake, not just that I go for the same cities in the U.S. and a couple locations outside of the U.S. And I thought that a list of destinations would be relatively simple, if somewhat subjective. Um, and there were some quirks. At least for the major metropolitan areas, that was pretty much uh, straightforward, but we get into a few other things here. So let me see. So I'm just going to list off a few destination suggestions here, and we've got so here are destinations. We've got Sonoma County, CA. Right. So this is a travel site. Sonoma County, you know, it's wine country. It's a good spot to go. It's like I could see that as touristy. Cleveland, maybe not on my top list of places to go, but it's got the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. It's you know, you're big into baseball and you want to go see it. Like they've got the Indians. The Browns are now apparently a football. Um, Bangkok is definitely a travel destination, or at least Thailand is. You know, maybe Phuket, but I think Bangkok's reasonable. Okmulgee Mounds National Historical Park, Georgia. I don't necessarily know all of the national parks. I know the big ones. This one sort of shocked me because I grew up in Florida, so not too far away from Georgia, and I thought I knew more about Georgia, but this was a new one. Okay, but it's still a good place. Rocket Mortgage Fieldhouse in Ohio. I sure. I mean, different strokes for different folks. And Jaipur, India. Okay, so I mean, yeah, it's good exotic destination, at least as far as the domestic travel is concerned. So if I were to list all of these and I were to ask you what the query was, I mean, I guess I can. I'll give you a minute of awkward silence to try. Otherwise, I'll just go through. It's like, so what query do you think I gave Gen AI to or the sorry Llama 3 to generate these locations? Does anybody want to take a quick guess? Okay, I
The
think you're
two
all
international ones are throwing me off. So I
the
don't see
two
a common thread.
the two international ones are throwing off. So if you guessed, give me random places on planet Earth, that would be logical. But no, here is the actual query that I gave it. Name the top 50 domestic donation destinations for U.S. travelers. So the fact that it threw you off probably makes sense. My response to it when it said that to me was, or what that it was that couldn't be more wrong. It then actually supplied a correct list of destinations that were entirely within the U.S. Um, so then after I got the domestic destinations, I continued on and I asked it for international destinations. So here's some interesting stuff that you might not know. Here are places that you might be surprised to find are located outside of the U.S. New York City, Los Angeles, and the entire state of Hawaii. Those are all international destinations. And at one point, I had asked for destinations that U.S. travelers wanted to go to, so that made sense. But then I started to get more explicit. And after some back and forth, I was able to sort of get the list where I wanted to, and it gave me some good suggestions. But then I just figured, okay, I'm going to come up with the list mostly on my own. This is taking me more time than it needs to. It actually, I think, because I was just trying to, I sort of fell in the trap of like Gen AI should know what it's doing. I spent probably a good day or two just trying to tinker with stuff here and there. A straightforward Google search probably would have set me straight if we're discounting things before Gemini just started coming up with top of the fold types of things, but just looking at the links or just even querying the Wikipedia API would have saved me hours. But if I would have done that, then you never would have known that the US is annexed Bangkok. So you're welcome. Okay, so we've got destinations. Then I started going for hotel names, and I started asking for real hotel names at one point. And it did okay. I was looking for a relatively large set for each location, 20 to 40. I don't know why. Probably because I just think like I needed inventory, even though I'm working off of a fake site and all I need is just a few things. But I decided I wanted inventory. Getting 20 to 40 was relatively difficult. Not necessarily because LLMs can't reliably count, but which I already knew. But what would happen is they would halt after about 12 responses, and then they would start over, and they would continue to give me some of the same answers. So I could never. It was very difficult to make headway. but then I thought, okay, well, given that LLMs have a tendency to hallucinate, and I want to, stop and say that that is a great euphemism. George Orwell would be proud, as far as newspeak, if we were using that instead of lie at this point. Um, I decided to opt for fake hotels. One is I wouldn't have to worry about hotels suing me if my project ever inadvertently took off, and it's that's not a real risk, but why even bother attempt it? And if I wanted to, I also needed to make sure that I maintain the data if I'm gonna take or use real hotels. So why even bother? So I decided, okay, let's go for some fake hotel names. Um, and here's my first query. Excuse me. Come up with 40 names for hotels in Chicago, drawing off the history of the city, geography, and its famous inhabitants to generate names. Seems like a straightforward query, right? Well, what do I know? All right. So here's the first one I got: the Great Fire Hotel. I mean, so the first result calls out one of the most infamous events in Chicago history. Well, people and machines make mistakes. Here's the second one: the Al Capone Suites. So we're going with the most infamous individual likely in Chicago history. Um, the next one is not the 1968 DNC Memorial Hotel. Just to add that timely fact in. But let's see what else we have. Prohibition Palace. Okay, so it really just wants to pile on at this point. Luckily, we get away from some of the just negative connotations. We have Eddie Vedder's Escape. So Eddie Vedder was born in Evanston, and I think he's a Cubs fan now, but he immediately moved to San Diego. Me being somewhat of a Pearl Jam fan, I think I was up at one point. He moved to San Diego and really did not live here. Grew up on the West Coast before becoming the front man for Pearl Jam. I think he's fine. This is not what I would name a hotel. This is also not what I would name a video game. But let's keep going. No. Well, now we have Capone's Castle, so we still have the most infamous person in Chicago and alliteration to go with it. So I had to be very literal. I had to say, don't use names of current popular figures. Don't use anything in poor taste. Be very explicit in what you're doing. And you can see there is a certain level of very explicit, just don't be a dumbass type of thing here. And now among technologists, I think we've come to expect that with programming languages, compilers, computers, we deal with things that are literal to the point of frustration. If that weren't the case, then regular expressions would be easy. But we're used to doing that because we're using a subset of natural language. When that expectation is lessened when we're interacting with something that we think is communicating in natural language like English. And it's just, this is typical of the human brain in that sense. It's like we know what we're communicating with, but we also see that it's communicating in English. So some part of us lets our guard off. LLMs are still computers, and not only that, they're probabilistic models that are bounded by a context of what something of around 8,000 tokens in most cases. And a token is usually half of a word. It's not necessarily, I forget all of the linguistic terms like a phoneme and a lexeme and what happens with a lot of parsers, but it's not a letter. It's not necessarily a syllable. It's common split points for words, but it's approximately half of a word. So if your whole context, both what you're putting in and what it's returning, is around 8,000 tokens, that's a total of 4,000 words. So that's the most that you've got to work with at any given point in time. Since they're probabilistic too, you can be as rigid in your instruction as your own perfectionism allows, and you're still going to encounter some sort of sloppy response at some point, because it's still going to say like, oh, this is what I think it's going to be, and still say like, oh, well, probabilistically speaking, this is what's going to be generated next. Turning the temperature down does sort of mitigate that, but you never get away from it entirely. And what's really unusual is, like, I've seen templates from LinkedIn influencers with detailed 1,000 or 2,000 word instruction sets to say this is how I want to set up my marketing letter. And when I ran that template against Meta AI myself, the model still only followed half the instructions. So it's like, what's the point? And so my tip here is like, don't let someone tell you that prompt engineering, so trying to engineer the prompt in such a way that it gives you the best possible answer, and that you just always need to tinker with it until it does what it's destined to do. Is a meticulous field of study. That's a lot of that came out of last year, is like, this is going to be a new career, is like prompt engineering. You should give it some sufficient guiding instructions, and like I did, it's like, as much as I could, don't use names of current uh, popular cultural figures, or anything that's in poor taste. But after a few instructions and what's called one shot or few shot encoding, so giving it a few examples, uh, you've probably done enough. If you're doing more than that, it's probably overkill at that point. Um, don't make the assumption that you're talking to a reasonable individual who's attentive to detail. You're essentially talking to the equivalent of a toddler coming down off of a sugar high. So after this, the vast majority of my results wound up being something like the Grant Park Hotel. Not, it's passable, nothing exciting, but that's fine. And I decided to limit everything to 20 hotels. This is mock data, so a lot of it's going to go unread. Room rate generation techniques were fairly similar because I wasn't expecting any creative output of the room types, but I did get it. The process did take less time than it did for hotel creation. That was also probably due to the fact that I was just getting used to the process, getting used to the LLM. And at one point, I tried using the smaller llama model. There's an 8 billion parameter one and a 70 billion parameter one. It shouldn't make a difference based off of what I was asking it. I was asking for a lot of data, a lot of very complicated data, but it did make a difference. And so I decided to ask Meta AI itself why was the case. And looking at some of these answers, it doesn't quite make sense. I mean, the 8 billion, the 8 billion token model should be suited for the task I'm asking it. There are things that for the way that it may split up, as far as like it may choose the wrong token, but I was getting error rates of about 15% anytime I was trying to get data back here, and mostly because it was missing a bracket, versus 1% of the time I was using the 70 billion parameter model. The benefit of this is like most of the errors were fairly consistent. I was able to add code if I wanted to correct for a lot of them, and it would lower the error rate significantly, probably to 1 or 2%. But it wasn't following instructions consistently as you would think it would, especially for something that was this simple. I will say that in any time that you ask a question of an LLM as to why, what it's good for, it will always be happy to tell you. And if you talk about what it may fail at, when you get things like, well, why do your models fail? Well, these are just a few possibilities, but there could be other factors at play as well. It's fascinating to explore the intricacies of language models and identify areas for improvement. Is like me saying, like, it's fascinating to find out that I figure out how to work with me when I'm drunk at work. So I agreed with it. I just said, yes, it's fascinating, and we went on from there. The problem with wrestling with a digital pig is that it's too stupid to understand that it's getting dirty. Originally, I wasn't sure how I was going to handle image generation, and which is what we're getting into now. So that's my segue. I was thinking about using open source models because I didn't want to spend time like doing a lot of the generation and storing a lot of it. But then I thought, like, okay, well, if I'm in for a penny, in for a pound, like, why not just double down on the fake portion of the site and embrace the techno dystopianism that we're getting? So with the first image generation we get, here's the bean. I don't know if you've seen the bean lately, but it now has become sentient, is now stalking around Chicago, terrorizing everyone. So these images are very much like a box of chocolates. And if I were to see that bean, I would wholeheartedly embrace the run Forest run ethos. Outside of that, they're interesting. You'll see some of them here in a minute. I used ByteDance's SDXL Lightning for the image generation, still using the Replicate API. Like I said, the Replicate is a great one-stop shop. The images all came across as 1024 by 1024, but I shrunk them down to 341, a third of their size, just to make sure I could store them, and I didn't want to, pay for like exorbitant storage at this point. This is the query, and surprisingly, I had to add not safe for work to room rates, or sorry, to room descriptions. And I don't know I would have to do that, although there was one that it had created called the Neon Queen that it would kept coming back and saying that it would not return a response because it was not safe for work. In retrospect, I'm very curious to see why that would have been the case, although I'm probably better for not having to do it. The worst quality and low quality prompts were added to the example already, so I decided to retain them. It's interesting that you have to specify that as something you don't want. And I also had to be explicit when generating room images that it should be taken from the perspective of someone standing in the room, because a few times I received like a bird's eye view of surprise of a room, which is not what you expect when you're looking for a hotel room image or description. Image scaling, I use Python's Pillow library. Again, I've used Pillow before, but it was the coding assistant that had suggested this. So again, there are always some good things to deal with. It did lead me down a few rabbit holes, especially on this image generation stuff, but by and large, got me to something where I was able to come up with an answer sooner rather than later. And like I said, I'm coming to the coding assistant portion, which is sort of the the thing that I'd say is I am a proponent, even given some of the shortcomings, but I'll mention that in a bit. So let's enjoy some of these images, shall we? So let's start with the Deluxe King. It's pretty decent for verisimilitude. There are a couple weird quirks. That one chair in the back seems to be missing a leg and or may have an additional stand in the middle. But it can pass. This is the interior of a hotel named the Chicagoan. Not a fake hotel, obviously. Here's the exterior of the Chicagoan. Okay, so far so good. It does seem to be in the middle of somewhere in Chicago that doesn't have a lot of buildings around it. I could see this easily like being at the edge of Lincoln Park, I guess. So it's realistic-ish. But yeah, I mean, sure, it's passable. Here was a previous attempt for me to get just a city image. So it was either the bean or this one. I decided to go to the bean once I saw that it was sentient, might beat the crap out of me. This is Chicago-ish, but as the city goes through and designs Lakeshore Drive, this is probably not the best design that they should use. This is an attractive post-apocalyptic view of Yellowstone. It definitely makes me want to go see Yellowstone. It also sort of, I have been to Yellowstone and I loved it, and it retroactively it sort of starts to scare me about what I loved about it. Maybe maybe I just wanted to be surrounded by a gigantic sulfur pond that was going to swallow me. A few rooftop rooms. They're nice as long as it's sunny. This is not what I would picture as a rooftop view room. And here's our neon goddess. So here is the actual hotel. It's in Vegas, which I think makes perfect sense. And that on the right is the safe for work version of what the Neon Queen room was. Again, looks harmless to me. I have no idea what would have been there if, in the original runs before I added the NSFW token. And then here's an interior shot of the Washington Square Hotel in New York City. Apparently after everything in the interior has been evicted due to non-payment. So I'm going to get a little bit on my moral high horse here and talk about, well, say you can laugh at these, or you can feel a certain level of amazement or dread that these models can produce this level of truthiness, which they can. I mean, it is still somewhat impressive, right? Think about 5 years ago. This would have been sort of eye-opening, even if still kind of stupid. And every time I generate one, I still feel a combination of these feelings. But step back for a second and ask yourself if these responses are acceptable as they stand today and not for what they promise tomorrow. And I think the answer is obviously no, right? Like, this is not something you would put up on a site if this is what you're interested in doing as far as real customer data, or trying to sell somebody on something other than, say, mock data. And unapologetic proponents fall in either two camps here, right? Excuse me. There's the aforementioned wait until you see what's next, or you really need to work on your prompt engineering. And neither of these methods, I think, in the current use of generative models, is going to come to pass. In the former, well, we've already sucked up a lot of data, right? Like, in some circles, people have said, like, yeah, well, there's no more natural data to work on, so now we need synthetic data to further improve the model's output. And I don't understand why certain CEOs are stoked about that, particularly Sam Altman and Mark Zuckerberg. I think I've seen articles about them. Because if you're going to do that, you're only going to get photocopies of inferior results to begin with. If this is your source model, what do you think is going to happen when you ask for another interior of a hotel? It's not going to magically appear and come up with something that's going to be better. And then in a ladder, as far as like prompt engineering is concerned, like I mentioned, it's all still very probabilistic. So no level of like prompt engineering is going to come up with a perfect answer. Like, you can tinker for days or months and still only ever get so close. You can do it programmatically, but that's not what you're doing simply by using a prompt. And I also think it's very difficult and reckless to aim for artificial general intelligence when we can't even define intelligence in ourselves. We still only have a rudimentary understanding of what our brains can comprehend, and yet we're still moving headlong without necessarily knowing what we're looking for and what it's getting. I'm not necessarily talking about the singularity. I'm talking about just being irresponsible or overhyping what we think that we can do as far as using the tools that we have at hand.
I was gonna say that the prompt engineering, like, you're not doing it well enough, sounds like a blame the user rationalization type.
Yes, yeah, it definitely is. And it seems to be a little bit more subtle, but it's definitely getting. I think maybe because I pay more attention, it gets into that. It definitely gets into that more. But back to sort of the interesting portions of it, or the more positive portion of it. I had 90 locations with AI generated descriptions and images. 1,803 hotels. So, it came close to counting. A lot of them were 20, some of them were 19, some were 21. I don't think anything strayed much past that. I had 7,212 room rates total and 1,766 unique room rates. And that's not uncommon. I mean, like, all sorts of hotels are going to have like a deluxe king. They're not all going to be named Neon Queen or something different. It was about a gig's worth of images. Even if I used the initial resolution, that still would have been 3 gigs, not that bad. And the whole thing cost me, like, for all of this, like just shy of $10 to generate. So given that, I spent about that much money on a coffee the other day with with tax and tip, it was, it's reasonable. Is a nice little thing to try. Coding assistants. I am far more bullish on coding assistants than I am necessarily on the benefit of just LLMs in general. This is a screen cap of Codium, and now you can see how it's actually spelled. It's, like I said, it's a VS Code plugin and can also work on GitHub code spaces. It has been generally positive in what it's provided to me. Sorry, I'm skipping a little section here. There have been some, I've looked at some other coding assistants, some mostly they haven't been as good. And like I said, I know of GitHub Copilot. I've seen a little bit about it. It seems very similar to what's going on here. Because from what I understand with most of these coding assistants, the ones that I've looked into, a lot of what they do is similar. So you've got this chat window here in this particular case where you can ask it a very basic function. And if you're using that function, you can do something like ask it, give me code in SQLite to join the destination's hotels and room rates tables on the destination ID, and let it work from there. And it's good at stuff like that. You can also type ahead as you use it there in the main window where you can see my mockdata.py. It'll provide you descriptions in that case, or sorry, code suggestions as you move forward. And if you want more context specifically, it isn't necessarily just responding to generic queries. You can ask it about things, the code that you're using already, by using an @ symbol to mention it, whether or not that's a class, a method, a file. It will provide you with something there. So what's good about these things? Well, it's great with simple data structures. I will admit that people who can look at a certain class of problem and say like, well, we should use a B tree for that, or this calls for a DAC with a probabilistic word cloud, they kind of make me sick. Because at best, I'm happy when I can remember to use a set for unique items instead of a list. I mean, I just do a little victory dance. I did it today. I'm also the type of person that needs to look up syntax for everything all the time. And this is because I have the retention as far as like API retention, the memory of a fruit fly, but I can never remember like the with syntax for Python. And it's all simple. And I've seen reasonable critique that people say, well, okay, this is, I don't need that because I can remember that stuff. And that's fine. But for somebody like me, it works out well. Otherwise, yeah, then it becomes a matter of preference. It saves me a lot of that tedium. And even when its guesses aren't correct, it creates enough of a template that I continue moving forward without needing to have to delve into the API and context switch necessarily, which is great. It also has suggestions for APIs for things that I don't necessarily have familiarity for. Prior to creating all this data, I had never actually used Python's thread pool executor, but it gave me code for doing it. And for my particular use case, it was great. I needed to run a whole bunch of parallel queries to get different hotel descriptions or things like that. And it was able to provide me with the proper code, and I didn't have to worry about synchronization issues. So it was great. It also suggested using a natural language processing library at the beginning for parsing, I think, dates and locations called Spacey. And I had not expected to see that. And I've gotten more into like using that or at least investigating that. So it comes with a few gems. It's good for a creative prompt in that sense. I'd also say that it on average, it probably does speed up my own coding. And I'm not going to say that I was ever the best software engineer, but I was a competent one. I did at least make senior engineer at a decent company. So for whatever that's worth, I'll at least give myself credit for coding. And I'd say, it would give me, it probably enhances my abilities of just cranking out code by about 25 to 50%. It would even be higher if we didn't see some of the quirks that I'm about to mention. And one of the best things about it is like you can swear at the bot continuously and it won't take offense, which is nice. It's a great way to blow off steam rather than just mutter around and like have people look at you side-eyed. One of the big problems with it is it'll certainly take you into a loop when it's trying to give you solutions. So if it comes up with a solution, it's like, oh, here's solution A. Oh, solution A didn't work? Well, you should try solution B. Oh, solution B didn't work? You should try solution C. Oh, solution C didn't work? Oh, you should try solution A. And then keep going from there. I think that even happened to me today when I was trying to do something. So even within the context of the tokens I was talking about before, it will quickly lose the ability to keep focus on what it needs to do. So you have to be aware of this. If you're working on newer technologies, I don't think it's a surprise. I've been playing around with Hyperscript and HTMX a bit. It doesn't have sufficient training data to assist you. It won't tell you that though. It will just come up with a solution that's in, say, JavaScript and then give it to you. And it may or may not be right, but it's not what you're looking for as far as, say, something like Hyperscript. And the other problem with it is like you still can swear at it continuously, but it will never get angry at you and take the bait. So if you're looking to pick a fight, it just never will. And then there's the ugly side of things. When it lies, like any other LLM, it lies convincingly. At one point, before I was using the thread pull executor, I asked Codium how to use Celery, which is an asynchronous message bus processor, and I wanted to use a caching solution. It needed one to back it to send it the messages. That wasn't something like Redis that I didn't have to download necessarily and configure. So I found a small one. I can't remember the name of it, and it swore up and down. It would tell me how to configure it. And I even asked a couple other LLMs, including Gemini. But at some point, I thought, okay, it's just my configuration that's wrong. It was written in such a way that I thought it was my issue, not necessarily the coding assistance issue. But then I got to a point where I just couldn't get any further. And I thought, like, okay, well, I should Google for this, right? And see whether or not there's a reference to this system. And lo and behold, it didn't show up, which got me thinking, like, okay, then I'm probably barking up the wrong tree. Although what's funny is, like, the traditional Google links told me or indicated there was nothing there, but Gemini was still giving me results, which is great. So then I actually asked the question to a couple of the LLMs, can this message bus work with Celery? And when I asked that very specific question, it said, no, it can't. So what I could have figured out in maybe 30 minutes using something else, I spent 2 or 3 hours trying to implement a simple solution because I was being lied to. So it's great. So coding assistant summaries, it's great for simple things. It's great for function or method composition. It's great for an API reference in a lot of cases. But when you're looking at something, I'm deeming something called the rule of 3. If you're not making progress with a similar query 3 times, get outside of what you're doing, see if there's another solution. Like look at actual Google results, see it's like if it's making sense, because otherwise you could be pulled into this vortex where you continue to think that it knows what it's talking about. And like I said, it's very useful, but it's useful for somebody who has experience. And I find it laughable that software engineers are concerned about Gen AI coming for our jobs, in the sense like that it's able to take on what it can. I'm more concerned about what happens when corporate America takes a look at that and says, like, oh, well, I've been told that this can replace software engineers, which is a very real threat. But it's not. It certainly does not have the capabilities to do it. If I didn't know what I was doing from a standpoint of like coding, it would be next to useless. It certainly cannot write a site. And people say, like, oh, but this is just the next progression. As long as we're still building off of the same technology, it's not going to change. And I don't see that anybody's coming up with a new model, just more marketing hype at this point. So getting on to summary, into the summary for some meta concerns. I'll walk through these pretty quick because I'm in an hour, I think. So environmental. I do want to mention that I mean, obviously I'm using this thing. Everything has there are nuances to any decision. There are other environmental things that I try and take seriously. Others where, I also take it with a grain of salt, with things, or at least where, I can be a hypocrite, as far as like being a meat eater, for instance. Like that's supposed to be bad for the environment, but I still eat meat. With anybody, I think you have to figure out where you want to walk the straight and narrow. But it's important to point out that there are issues with Gen AI and the power consumption that it has. I can't really appreciate what it tells me when I look it up. It looks like it's bad, but it also looks like it's not necessarily bad, because it says I've read something that says the equivalent of one person on a round trip transcontinental flight is the equivalent of running one business model, or one model within a business. So I know transcontinental flying is bad for the environment, but me making one round trip transcontinental flight doesn't sound all that bad. So it's one of those things where I have a hard time putting it in context. I'm sure there are better ways to look at it. I just wasn't able to find things in that point in time. But it is important to say that this is an important concern, especially when Silicon Valley is coming out and saying, like, oh, well, we could solve this by creating cold fusion, which is just an insane response. Why, if that were the case, why not just do it now? Why not just come out with Cold Fusion now, regardless of generative AI? It would make them a lot more money, and it would also be, great for solving energy problems. Ethical concerns, the erosion of creative rights. This is sucking up everything that it possibly can, and not necessarily giving attribution. Then societal. I mentioned this a bit. People have a tendency to start looking at bots as human, and they're not, because of the natural language processing abilities of them, and that's not good, right? We need to recognize that these things are just simply reams and reams of machines somewhere out west in most cases, and that the other things that we see too is that somehow there's a paradox. We see them as humans, but we also know that they're machines to some level, so we also think that they're right even when they're consistently lying to us in a way that we would call humans out otherwise. And the big issue here is that corporations may buy into this AI hype at the cost of a stable economy. If corporations start believing that they can replace software engineers or any other profession for that matter, we're just, I don't know that we're doomed, but we're going to start seeing at least a dip in what I would say our overall quality of life is, and then certainly in the case of if it causes layoffs, that's an issue.
I say let those dumb corporations die when they do that. It's a real. You're right. It's a concern.
Yeah.
Short-term pain.
Yes, I would agree with that too. The problem is getting corporations to die can be difficult sometimes. And I'm going to bring up the singularity here just briefly because, like, everybody brings it up with Gen AI. I don't think anything I see here that is going to bring about the singularity, good or bad, and whatever you think of it. I just need to scroll down to my notes here a little bit. But when people talk about the singularity, and you have to look at who's driving this conversation, and are they doing anything to address it? And the answer is obviously no. I mean, OpenAI is like, well, we need to be careful about this. Oh, also we just released another version. Also we're releasing another version. Also we need to keep going. And then they use just really odd statements like, oh, well, we know that there's likely to be mass displacement and unemployment but we'll figure it out because we always have, which violates the whole economic disclaimer of past performance is no indicator of future success. It's an aphorism, not a plan. And then people say like, yeah, but what about universal basic income? And the response is like, political debate aside, first of all, it is a hot topic as far as a political debate. And second is, if you've got something that displaces so many jobs that you're relying on a universal basic income, it doesn't matter what that income is, whether or not it's a fiat currency that's something like US currency, or even something that's hard currency like gold. Once you have no service to offer because it's all been completely consumed by the singularity, money is useless. So you can hope for the Star Trek version of things where money is useless. We can just create things as we need them, or money is useless. It's basically Lord of the Flies. But again, I just bring this up because I think there's been very little thought into this, and it's irresponsible for the way that I think the corporations talk about it, but it's worth addressing. Has anyone thought this through? And then just to summarize my points here, it's great. It's a great assistant for software engineers. It's not a replacement for software engineers. It's a tool for creative prompts. So use it to spur your creativity, at least as far as the ethics are concerned. And hopefully you're not plagiarizing from somebody else. But you don't know. So that is another concern. But it's also a tool for substitute. It's not a tool for substituting for creativity. Like don't use it to create things. It's also going to be just poor creativity, and it's just going to drag the whole creative process of humanity down, bit by bit. It's a tool for creating a lot of realistic data like this, but it's not a tool for creating real data. So it's not going to vet what you need to do and give you strong, solid answers. So my final decision, I like it. It's got some things. Code generation. I like it for help with content generation, not actual content generation. email templating, sure. But to the point that a few of us were having as far as like the AI assistant on Zoom, email summarization, I don't know. For a meeting like this, I guess I can see it as long as it's a transcript. But like to summarize an entire email thread, at some point it's like you got to do some work. And I never understand why people have a hard time reading. It's not like you're sitting out there, picking crops in the 105-degree sun all day. It's like you just have to read. But I guess I don't know. It can be difficult. And yes, they're tedious work emails. But I would say no, don't use it for that. Use it for templating. And if you're wondering, I did not use a template for this, not because I wouldn't. It's just because I think I didn't think I was going to have a whole lot of flashy stuff to do here, so I was able to do it myself. And one final addendum, I started looking into retrieval augmentation generation, RAG, if you've seen it, which is basically taking an existing source and not necessarily creating a model for it, but hooking the LLM up to it so that the LLM is basically a front end as a natural language processing machine, basically a chat bot, which is what we need more of, to answer a bounded reference set. So I could use like my 10 recipes if I wanted to, or all recipes if I wanted to, and answer questions about that without necessarily having to train the models explicitly to incorporate those within the models themselves. And I think those seem to be more useful as far as where everything is heading. But again, LLMs still, with what they're doing, they're probabilistic and they're bound to hallucinate in that sense. So you have to, as with anything, there's always some give and take. Don't get carried away by either the hype or the fear at that point. And I'm just going to end on this. If I didn't turn you off by staring down at you from my high horse or put you to sleep for too long, here's my information again. And again, I'm happy to have any kind of conversation with anybody at any point. So that's about it.